So we're good to go. And I'll just be really brief about this. I don't see any scenario in which we're not going to have a government shutdown. I think that this is uh, the two sides are too dug in that Donald Trump and his administration and the Make America Great Again Republicans see advantage in a government shutdown. They think Russell Veit thinks in particular that it will allow them to continue to cull the federal workforce, which is something they want to do in general, and maybe once the government is open again, to replace the people that they haven't furloughed but fired with loyalists or partisans, and so to be able to continue the campaign to exercise much greater unilateral control over the entire executive branch from the executive office, from right the White House and the suite of offices associated with it. And the Democrats, on the other hand, I think are more clear-eyed than they were last time about the fact that both institutionally, the Democrats in Congress have nothing to gain by simply allowing this administration to continue to its path towards autocracy and to not use the very limited leverage that the Democrats have to exact some concessions. And what those concessions should be, I'm frankly not entirely sure. I know there are a number of commentators who think a lot about this who have said that it shouldn't just be healthcare. That's what the Democrats are holding out for right now, restoration of the cuts to Medicaid and to Obamacare that were put into the big, beautiful bill. And unless they get that, then the Republicans are in the position of having to defend programs that are very popular, that are being cut very drastically in order to create tax cuts for the wealthy. That sounds like a political winner to the Democrats, but whether or not they should be pushing back more directly on the illegality and autocracy of this administration, on the deployment of troops and the way in which ICE is being used, that's, I think, the topic for the debate. But the general idea that Trump does not want any appearance of weakness. And so he is not willing to negotiate, not even willing to speak with the Democratic leadership. And on the other hand, that the Democrats have concluded that there is nothing to do other than to impede this administration means that neither side has a reason to budge right now. And we'll have to see, how much damage and in what ways a government shutdown does, right? Is it going to be something that actually augments Donald Trump's power, which is what Chuck Schumer feared the first time a continuing resolution was passed during Trump's presidency? Will it be something that slowly but surely further erodes the capacity of the federal government? And that erosion is well underway, and I expect we're going to start seeing the consequences of a less competent, less functional, less well-staffed federal government in all the ways in which our society relies on it. Will it put a further drag on an economy that is very difficult to understand as having a single direction, right? We got more inflation data, and it is not terrible, but it's not great either. There's some signs of problems with the job market, but not really fully recessionary yet. But would, impeding the capacity of the federal government to continue to make its contribution to the American economy further pull the economy in the direction of a recession? Will that create leverage for either side? I'm not sure. We'll talk about this in greater detail next week, but I just want to note that I think by the time we get to next Saturday, we should anticipate that there will be a government shutdown, and the politics around it will be something that we can concentrate our attention on. But for today, I want to focus instead on concluding the September lecture series. And so we've been talking all month about the Constitution and the court. And we focused primarily on what's happening in 2025 because I think, frankly, some long-term trends have now become both crystal clear and inescapable for most people paying attention to what's happening with the Constitution and the court. And those trends are not just that the system of checks and balances no longer works to preserve the rule of law when you have single party dominance over at least two branches, the presidency and Congress, and maybe all three branches, as appears to be the case right now, and a president and a party with no commitment to the values, the principles, the institutional norms that are required to sustain the rule of law. That therefore the American Constitution does not protect us against autocracy, but deeper still, the limitations of our Constitution, the fact that we are still trying to muddle through with an 18th century architecture and 21st century problems is creating pressure for autocracy, pressure for overthrowing the rule of law, if that is the only way to get things done. And so my, in a sense, hope, right? It's a peculiar way to express it, but my hope for the Trump administration is, on the one hand, that the culture of the United States, our commitment to regular and reasonably free and fair elections, to not using the power of the state in the way that it's used in Russia or Hungary, in what's sometimes called competitive authoritarianism, to mount the show of an election, but nevertheless to use state power to make it such that the opposition has little to no chance of actually prevailing in the election. And I think it is increasingly clear that this is what Donald Trump and the Make America Great Again coalition wants, right? That they actually want to use state power so that we won't have free and fair elections in 2026 and 2028. But I continue to believe that the American people, and this includes not only Democrats and not only blue state liberals and not only people like me or maybe us who have a kind of principled understanding of what democracy and constitutional government means, but I think it's quite deeply woven into the culture and the mores of American society that this is ultimately the way in which we decide who our leaders are, what our policies will be, and that although there is increasing erosion of confidence in democracy, I hope that we are not yet ready to surrender it to autocracy. And so, having said all of that, assuming we have free and fair elections in 2026 and 2028, I'll then make two other assumptions, one of which is very much borne out by the polls, and I believe the reality of our current situation, that the Donald Trump program is increasingly unpopular with the majority of Americans. His approval rating continues to slip. If you look at him issue by issue, whether it's immigration or tariffs or inflation or economic policy, there's new polling out about using federal troops and law enforcement to police cities. Or you look at, right, the use of ICE as a widespread law enforcement agency. All of this stuff is unpopular. And so one assumption is that this will be a so-called thermostatic series of elections, that the American people will want to correct course, will move away from from the Republicans and the Make America Great Again movement within the Republican Party. The second assumption is that the Democrats will get their act together, that they will present a plausible alternative policy. And here is where I begin to tie it into what we're talking about. My sincere hope, especially for 2028 and 2029, and frankly, the entire 4 years thereafter, is that the Democrats will focus on institutional reform and the need for institutional reform. That the period of Donald Trump's ascendancy and domination of our politics will have made it clear to most Americans that the path we're on is a dead end, and that rather than simply alternating back and forth between more and more polarized but less and less plausible partisan options, we need to begin to look to the root of the problem. Why can we not actually build affordable housing in the United States in the 21st century? Why do we spend twice as much on medical care and yet get terrible results? Why can we not seem to come together on a program to address the glaring inequality in our society? Is it simply that one party is to blame, or is it in fact in ways that I believe Trump and the Roberts Court are increasingly exposing, that we need deep constitutional reform in the 21st century in order to update our Constitution, and that a Democratic leader, even a Republican, who were to embrace not a furthering of the MAGA agenda, but some off-ramp from what is clearly a road to nowhere, right? That they will have an opening to say to the American people, I'm not just doing what we've been doing for the last 20 years, alternating, tacking back and forth between, right, one-sided partisan agendas that have very little chance for actually addressing the problems they identify, but instead identifying the root problem, and that's in our institutions. Until we fix them, unless we fix them, our politics will not meet our needs, will not address our deep, abiding problems. And so that is where I've been pushing. It's not just about the fact that the Constitution and the court are failing miserably to prevent autocratic abuse of power by the president and his party. It is more, I think, deeply still that this Constitution and this court produce the symptom, produce the desperate turn to autocracy because they are so clearly dysfunctional. So we've talked about this in various ways throughout this course. I will simply note that the drumbeat goes on, right? With on the one hand, the abuse of power by the Trump administration in the last week has just become all the more clear, right? So the fact that James Comey has been indicted, that Fani Willis is being investigated, that Letitia James is being investigated, and that this is being done despite the fact that career prosecutors who have, right, maintained the basic integrity and standards of the Department of Justice have refused to do the president's dirty work. The result is that they're gone, and that frankly people who are totally unqualified to do the work are now doing it. And part of the reason they're there is because they do not adhere to the norms of the institution. I'm in my teaching at the college, looking these days at how institutions are sustained. And the short answer to a very complicated question is that they are only sustained when the people who animate them, when the people who do the day-to-day work that the institution requires in order to be functional, believe not just in the routines of the institution, but the values and principles, the goods that the institution realizes. If the Department of Justice is part of the system of the rule of law, and its value is to maintain and impartially administer the rule of law at the level of the federal government, and if the people who are now elevated within the department are not committed to that good, that value, the principles that articulate the good of the rule of law and the value of living in a society where our liberty and our freedom are protected by the institution of the rule of law. If it's no longer the case that the people making the decisions at the Department of Justice understand the institution in that way, well, it may still have the name Department of Justice on the facade, but it will not be that institution anymore. And this is taking hold. This is no longer a warning. This is now an observation. And the question is, how quickly is the Department of Justice, our federal law enforcement agencies, are the courts and other institutions on which we rely, transformed into instruments for the personal power of the President of the United States, initially to punish his enemies, but soon, no doubt, to continue to secure and maintain his power as he grows more unpopular as a result of abusing that power. That is the path that we are on, right? And the idea that the administration is targeting, right, the foundations, the law firms, the universities, the fundraising mechanisms, the individuals in positions of power to resist the president, means that, right, the broader structure, not just in the government, but in civil society, that gives us the security, the protection, the courage, the strength in numbers to resist the federal government, to resist the tremendous concentration of power that is in the hands of the occupant of the Oval Office, right? This is, again, right, happening in real time. And the fact that it is happening and that the system of checks and balances is failing, and that the Supreme Court, far from checking it, is in fact doing the opposite, is legitimizing and abetting, right, the spread of autocracy by disempowering lower courts, by overruling them, by at least temporarily restraining them, and doing so again in a way that is apparently lawless, that does not appear to be the way courts are supposed to operate. They're supposed to, right, consider briefs and arguments and issue reasoned opinions, when more and more of the action in our legal system goes into the emergency docket of the Supreme Court, where none of that applies. It is the case, again, that it looks like the people who are animating the Supreme Court do not adhere to the good, the values, the principles that we, the people, want from our Supreme Court. So although, right, it will continue to have its beautiful building that continues to look like the Supreme Court of the United States, that institution will no longer function in the way the Supreme Court of the United States is supposed to function. I'm going to be very quick about this, right? It continues, right? The autocratic expansion of power on the part of Donald Trump and the way in which it increasingly infects more and more institutions of our federal government. So the executive administrative agencies, right, that the Supreme Court just allowed Trump to fire a member of the Federal Trade Commission, and this is a clear sign that they are overturning Humphrey's executor. In a sense, they've already violated that precedent. That's the precedent that protects the independence of independent executive agencies, been there since 1935. The only way they can allow Trump to fire the Democratic appointed member of the FTC is if they basically believe that Humphrey's executor, the controlling decision, is no longer going to be law. They're going to overturn it soon. Trump is weaponizing law enforcement, the rule of law, and power agencies to attack the opposition. That's what's going on with James Comey. He's attacking freedom of the press to stifle criticism and dissent. That's what's going on with Jimmy Kimmel. And please note, right, despite the fact that Jimmy Kimmel is back on the air, the pressure on the network is, right, in fact, growing as a result of Jimmy Kimmel getting his show back. There's, right, the deal being proposed for TikTok, which we won't have time to talk about today, but that puts another centibillionaire, do you know this word, right? A person with $100 billion or more who is very conservative in charge of another major social media platform. This is the oligarchic capture of the institutions that are supposed to provide the infrastructure for the public sphere. This is not a society in which, right, a free press is going to be able to flourish. The use of ICE, right, to reassert racial despotism, a society in which, because of the color of your skin, a whole portion of the population is going to be intimidated, is going to live in fear of the failure of the rule of law, the failure of our society to uphold its rights, the idea that the right vice is closing on. The universities, law firms, charitable foundations, think tanks, political fundraisers, if they are perceived to be liberal or antagonistic to this administration, the militarization of state police power, the targeting, and frankly, the occupation of cities that are seen as, quote, opposition cities, right? This is the United States of America. And the fact that this is happening in Chicago and Memphis and Los Angeles, and please note, if Mamdani wins the New York City mayoral campaign, you can bet they're coming for New York, San Francisco, Oakland, etc., right? And so the fact that this is happening, but not only that it is happening, that it's happening with such rapidity, and that the apparent checks and balances are now being revealed to be completely inadequate to the task of actually restraining a president with autocratic ambitions when his party controls Congress, when the Supreme Court is sympathetic to his use of power, right? So the constitutional architecture has failed us. The thing that I think many of us thought was most valuable about the Constitution was not the way it structures democracy. That's clearly failed. But at least the way in which it prevents the abuse of power, the way in which it protects our rights, and that seems to be failing as well. Congress so far, and this may change with the government shutdown, but to a very limited degree, has been incapable of checking Trump. The Roberts Court, right, leaning heavily on the emergency docket, far from enforcing the rule of law, upholding precedent, protecting lower courts as they gather evidence. There's another case this week in which, right, the issue is the firing of federal employees, in which the judge has concluded that the federal government, the Department of Justice, systematically lied, misrepresented, that the information that was presented to the court was a farce. And there are statutory guidelines as to what has to be done in order to fire federal employees. The federal government represented itself as having followed the statutory guidelines. They were flat out lying when they said that. That's what the court has concluded. And yet, the court also concludes we are powerless to reverse this. As lawyers like to say, the egg has already been scrambled and it can't be unscrambled. And please note, this is one of those cases where, as the court was hearing the case, the Supreme Court overturned a temporary restraining order preventing the government from doing this. And so there are signs also of fracturing within our federal judiciary, an intrajudicial constitutional crisis. This makes it just so abundantly clear that our Constitution and our court no longer work in the 21st century. And as I've tried to convince you, that's in part directly because of the role assigned to the Supreme Court within our constitutional infrastructure, the role that the court has claimed for itself in Marbury v. Madison, the famous case in which it claimed the right to review judicially acts of Congress and of the president, and frankly, because of the way in which, $500 million, $1 billion, $2 billion have been spent to produce a court that is, I want to say, one of the most radically out of step courts, one of the most radically conservative and regressive courts in the history of this institution. And the fact that that coincides with Donald Trump's presidency makes it clear to, I think, any impartial observer that the direction that we're headed in is one of extreme regression. And when we look at the target list, what this court is likely to do in the next, and I don't know if it's 2 years or 5 years or 10 years, it certainly has a long list of places it can go to turn the clock back by 50 to 100 years on the growth of the administrative state, on the growth, therefore, of the power of our federal government to regulate our economy and society, on the rights revolution, whether that's rights that have tried to promote gender equality. Women's right to abortion is gone already. Will the right to birth control be next? Or the right of sexual minorities? Will gay people lose the right to be married and lose the right not to have their sexuality policed by the state? And then also civil rights. Affirmative action is gone. The Voting Rights Act has been considerably reduced. Will this continue? So we could add, by the way, the role of money in politics, our capacity to pass any kind of meaningful campaign finance reform. The list runs long of places where this court and this president will be able, if the status quo holds, to undo so much of what the last 100 years of democracy in the United States has accomplished. So, I now want to pose the question, is the Constitution to blame? I think you've already heard my answer, which is yes, the Constitution is to blame. But in order to buttress that and to move this conversation into a deeper and more productive vein, I want to ask the question, what do we want from a democratic constitution? And to do that well, I want to be in dialogue with one of the leading constitutional law scholars in the United States, Frank Michelman. And I don't know if this is a familiar name. Give me one moment. But Frank Michelman taught at Harvard Law. I hope I've got my years right, from 1963 to 1923, right? So for roughly 60 years, he has, as a result, trained many of the judges and justices who are currently on the federal bench. But he is also among the most cited scholars by the Supreme Court and among the most influential scholars on federal constitutional law. He helped to draft the South African Constitution as well. It's not just in the United States. And he's written literally hundreds of articles. I'm not exaggerating. He's had a long, productive, prolific career and only 3 books. One of them, Brennan and Democracy, jumps off from Justice Brennan, who Frank Michelman clerked for, and tries to articulate what he thinks of as Brennan's conception of constitutional democracy. And then 2 more recent books, both published in the last few years, Constitutional Essentials and Legitimation by Constitution. And these are the works I'm going to be focused on, the 2 most recent books, the books on the right. And I'm going to go to Michelman's work to have a partner to begin to ask this question. What should we want? What do we want from a democratic constitution? Michelman starts by defining a constitution. And I'll use his definition and then elaborate it. It's a little technical. The subjection of on-the-ground political government, right, whoever is in power right now, to a public and prior directive framework for the conduct of politics antecedently established and beyond any incumbent government's power to alter at will. So the analogy I like here, you're playing baseball, right? And 3 strikes and you're out, 4 balls and you walk. The strike zone is meant to be over the plate and above the knees and below the shoulders, right? And that much is agreed on. If you don't want to play by those rules, then you don't want to play baseball, right? And so there's some sense in which we have to have the rules of the game settled before we can start playing the game. Once the game starts, we're going to do everything we can to win within the rules of the game. But, right, that means we're going to struggle with each other. It doesn't mean we're going to attempt to alter the rules of the game while playing the game. And in a sense, the Constitution is supposed to do that for us in the game of politics, and where that game of politics is directed into a law-based state, a state that makes law in order to exercise coercive power, needs to also be constrained in advance by law in ways that tell it how law can be made, what law can do, what law cannot do. And so that is the function of a constitution for us. And Michelman focuses on 2 reasons that we should want to have a constitution like that. 2 goods served by regulating our ordinary political process by extraordinary law that constrains that process. One reason he refers to as regulatory. And here he says, right, that the aim is to restrict by higher order law what can be done with ordinary law. And so this is, right, often done at the founding or during the process of amendment, but it then restricts all subsequent generations in terms of what they can do. And that's part of the way we set the rules for the game. That's one of the core functions that we want from a constitution. But Michelman also focuses on a second function. And here, right, the title of the book is Legitimation by Constitution, but the phrase that comes to the fore again and again in both of these books is justification by Constitution. And so I want you to hear this. This is a little complicated, a little hard to understand, but I hope it makes sense. The Constitution, if it's going to justify my reason to accept the outcomes of the political process as legitimate, must, quote, supply a basis on which free and equal citizens, some of them finding deeply wrong and repugnant some of the laws right now issuing from the duly constituted authorities. So, right, let me focus on this half of the description first. Donald Trump and his administration are vastly expanding the scope and range of what immigration and customs enforcement can do. And let us assume, I think counterfactually, I don't think this is true, but having said that, let us assume for the sake of argument for a moment that what immigration and customs enforcement is doing is both constitutional and legal, right? Then I still say it is wrong and repugnant, right? It is awful. But having said that, if it is neither illegal nor unconstitutional, if Donald Trump is the duly elected president, if, right, Congress has given him yet more money to fund the expansion of ICE, and, right, the Constitution allows this, the law allows this, I have to say, right, I can freely and willingly accept those laws and be prepared to abide by them because we're playing the game, right? I may not like the fact that your baseball team is much better than my baseball team, and so my team's being shellacked. But having said that, the idea that we're playing the game by the rules that we agreed to gives me, in a sense, no complaint, right? You are able to say to me, this is the game you agreed to play, you accepted the rules, now you have to accept the outcomes. Our conduct is above reproach because we are playing the same game. But to take the other example for a moment, if Donald Trump assumes office and on the first day he's in office, he signs an executive order that says, despite what the first section of the 14th Amendment says, I say that persons born in the United States and subject to its laws are not necessarily citizens. I then say, wait a sec, that's not what the Constitution says. You are doing something unconstitutional. If the laws say, right, that you are not allowed to fire the heads of independent agencies when Congress has made it clear that they intend those agencies to have a kind of partisan balance so that they don't act simply as the instruments of the party or the president in control at the moment, then you're not playing by the rules anymore. Right? And so the Constitution no longer plays that justificatory role. So one of the ways that Michelman puts this is justification presupposes regulation. It's only if the rules constrain the game that we can rely on the rules of the game to make us accept, right? To say that it is legitimate for the party in power to do these awful, repugnant things that I hate. Right? But I'm going to accept it. I'm going to abide. I'm going to acknowledge that they won the election and this gives them the power to do it so long as what they do conforms with law and constitution. And here's where I'll begin my criticism of Michelman. And I want to say that while Michelman emphasizes that justification presupposes regulation. He puts it something like no justification without regulation. I want to emphasize that that assumes that the regulation in question is responsive to the sovereign people's evolving understanding of how and why they aim to regulate their politics. And so I kind of glossed over this, but on Michelman's formulation, it's primarily the founding generation that restricts, right, what the rest of us can do. Yet our Constitution does not say, right, the people of 1787, right? It says we the people of the United States. And that includes those of us who are alive now, every bit as much as it includes the founding generation. And so the idea that if this regulation is going to be the source of a justification that we can accept, it also has to reflect our understanding of what the Constitution means. To show this, I want to focus for a moment on this idea of justification by Constitution. And I don't know, you probably can't see the subtitles of these books, but the first is called On the Constitutional Theory of Political Liberalism. The second has the subtitle, A Dialogue on Political Liberalism. What is political liberalism? It's a book by John Rawls, right? John Rawls is arguably the greatest ever American political philosopher, one of the greatest political philosophers of the last century. This book, Political Liberalism, was published in the 1990s. And without going into all of the details, I want to focus on the principle that Michelman focuses on in his account of the justice and legitimacy of constitutional democracy. This is Rawls' principle of political legitimacy. He calls it a liberal principle, liberal in the 19th century sense of protecting liberty. Quote, our exercise of political power is proper and hence justifiable only when it is exercised in accordance with a constitution, the essentials of which all citizens may reasonably be expected to endorse in light of principles and ideals acceptable to them as reasonable and rational. Now, I just want to notice for a moment, right, that Rawls is emphasizing the essentials of the Constitution, right? The rights it protects, the core architectural structure, the procedures it sets up for determining who gets to exercise political power and how, right? And that portion of the Constitution has to be, right, endorsed by us in light of principles and ideals that we accept as reasonable and rational. And I want to suggest that this principle, in a sense, represents a two-way street, that we have to do the work of figuring out what our Constitution means and whether or not it is acceptable to us, but we also have to do the work of figuring out what our principles and ideals are, and then of making the Constitution reflect our reasonable principles and ideals as those principles and ideals evolve. Now, Michelman adds a few ideas to this. I'm going to be brief, but I do want to note them. The first is that reasonable disagreement extends to the interpretation of the Constitution itself. It's not just the case that we vehemently disagree about what the immigration politics of the United States should be, how ICE should enforce or not enforce various laws, whether or not cruelty should be part of the program in order to perhaps deter future immigration. Yes, we disagree about all of that. But in addition to that, we disagree about the very meaning of the Constitution. When is that a violation of the Fourth Amendment? When do roving sweeps in car washes, workplaces, and shopping centers constitute unreasonable searches and seizures? Well, we can't agree on that either, right? So what are we to do? This leads Michelman to suggest secondary proceduralism. It's not just the case that we have a constitution to establish a procedure that helps us to regulate our disagreement. We also need an institution that tells us what the Constitution means when we can't agree on that ourselves. And the Supreme Court, right, is the institution we have to resolve our constitutional controversies. But then Michelman adds, this assumes that the court is and can be seen to be guided by constitutional and legal fidelity, that they are working in a principled way to figure out what the Constitution means and to articulate, abide by, as necessary, extend the body of constitutional law that has built up over the nearly 250 years that we've been using this Constitution, and that they are not acting then as ordinary partisan or political figures, but doing some different work. That's the condition on which we can say, well, we may not agree about what the Constitution means, but we have an institution for resolving that. This means that, in Michelman's formulation, the justices of the Supreme Court need to be acting as the people's principals. They need to be doing our work, figuring out what our Constitution means to us, and that there is a two-way dialectic then over the meaning of the Constitution with the court and the other branches that are elected by and accountable to us, representing the sovereign people whose constitutional principles the justices should aim to be, right? Telling us what our Constitution means when we're having trouble figuring that out. And that raises this critical question. Does the current Constitution and the court, equipped with judicial review, I'm sorry, I think I meant to have judicial review in there, work to secure legitimacy in this way? And I want to say the answer is clearly no. And it's not just because the court has been captured and now no longer is doing the work of genuine principled constitutional interpretation, but is functioning much more as a hyper-partisan body, right, which disqualifies it, frankly. But it's also, frankly, because I think our Constitution has been too stationary for too long, and that we, although as the people of the United States may have evolved in our principles and ideals, we have been incapable of making our Constitution better reflect our understanding of what it should mean. And having said all of that, what that does is put a tremendous amount of pressure on the court to act as our principals, and a tremendous temptation on the part of political actors, especially very well-funded political actors, to try to capture the court so that they can get it to do what they want done. So I'm about to propose reform to get us to a constitution that better meets the demands of legitimacy, of justification by constitution, that doesn't overburden the court to constantly extend the Constitution in the absence of direct feedback from the people. But first, I have to say just a little bit more diagnostically that the problems of 2025 and the 21st century in general reveal that our Constitution, our amended and reinterpreted 18th century Constitution, can no longer house the kind of democratic and effective politics it was frankly never designed for. I go back to Erwin Chemerinsky. This is a constitution designed for the 18th century. We're in the 21st century. We don't have 13 states and a few million people. We have 50 states and a few hundred million people. We don't have a backwater agrarian economy. We have the largest and most innovative and frankly, one of the highest concentrations of wealth in the world, right? And our technology is obviously very different from 18th century technology. And we have partisanship, right? The founders hoped that we wouldn't, but in fact, we have hyper-partisanship. So, right, the more democratic branches of the federal government are dysfunctional, right? Congress and the presidency, right? Part of the reason that the presidency is being taken over to dismantle the functioning of the executive branch is because the executive branch is not functioning very well. Congress is not functioning very well. And these are not problems rooted in our immediate politics. These are problems rooted in our Constitution. It creates too many veto points, too many places where legislation can be blocked. It can be blocked in committee. It can be blocked on the floor of the House. It can be blocked by filibuster in the Senate. It can be vetoed by the president. It can be overridden by the court. That's no way to get law made in a dynamic, accelerated society, the kind of society we live in the 21st century. It is also the case that because there are so many veto points, there are too many opportunities for capture, for vested interest to control our political process. And frankly, it excessively amplifies minority power. The equal representation of each state in the Senate, the way in which the Electoral College works, makes it too easy for the minority to exercise power over the majority in the United States. The Supreme Court is currently the most functional branch of the federal government. You just need 5 people to vote, and you can get the Constitution's interpretation altered, right? And that creates an incredible incentive to capture the Supreme Court. This is what has happened, and the long-term effort to remake the federal judiciary, and especially the Supreme Court, is now taking hold, and it is exposing to us, especially in concert with Donald Trump's second term, just how flimsy and dysfunctional our constitutional architecture has become in the 21st century. And so what we have now is a Supreme Court serving to amplify anti-democratic, minority, and partisan views, to legitimize executive autocracy, not to protect individual rights or procedures that safeguard the rule of law when they're attacked by the majority. The Supreme Court is not acting to do its job. It's barely acting as a court in the 21st century. We cannot rely on it to help us or to save us. And so let me then turn to a principle for institutional design that I think was fundamentally neglected by our founders. State structures, governmental agencies that concentrate power while attenuating paths for democratic input and accountability, invite efforts, and then lend themselves to capture by the wealthy and the powerful, right? Institutions like this, and please note that the Supreme Court is one of them, funnel constitutional and ordinary politics into channels that are highly advantageous to those with concentrated social power who can organize their wealth and resources to influence or capture these institutions. We talked about this last week. $500 million, $1 billion, $2 billion spent to appoint conservative law school professors so that the law school students with the right credentials could rise to positions of power within the legal profession and then the courts, funding, their scholarships to law school, their clerkships, their network, their ascendancy, influencing elections so that those people would be appointed to the judiciary and eventually promoted to the Supreme Court. This is a long-term, patient, expensive campaign, but it's the kind of campaign that an institution like the Supreme Court invites, especially when we have become a more oligarchic society, a society with hyper concentrations of wealth. Why not capture the most effective institution in the federal government? And then please note, once captured, they're resistant to the formation of countervailing powers by people who have less wealth, less concentrated social power, but maybe greater numbers. The court, in particular, we can't change it quickly or directly through election. So our history suggests the need for reform. I'm going to be very brief with Jill Lepore. I've already recommended her book, We the People, to you. I've already shown you this diagram, which indicates, right, 12,000 efforts, not just, people cooking up an idea like I'm about to do, but efforts to amend the Constitution that have made their way to being proposed on the floor of Congress. 12,000. And how many have actually been ratified? 27. And as Lepore shows in, I think, great and convincing detail, that's not because there were only 27 good amendments proposed. That's because it's too damn hard to amend the Constitution. That is, by the way, not what the founders wanted, but they did not anticipate that the structure they created would be so hard to use, so easily blocked and defeated, and that it would create this perverse dynamic in which people would aim to block amendment and then capture the Constitution and use the Constitution in the way that they see fit to accomplish ends, frankly, they cannot accomplish democratically. So, my proposal is that we amend the 5th article to the Constitution, the constitutional article that controls amendment, which currently says, right, that 2/3 of both houses have to propose and 3/4 of the states have to ratify amendments. But please note, right, that there's another procedure that is provided for in Article 5, right? And that is that a constitutional convention can be called for by the legislatures of 2/3 of the states. And what I am going to propose is that we need a constitutional amendment to revise Article 5, to make it easier in the future to amend the Constitution. And what I'm going to suggest is to do this, we will require long-term, sustained grassroots organizing, a social movement that attempts to break through the hyper-partisanship of American politics and say to the American people, we need to have greater control of our Constitution. Whatever we disagree about, we should be able to agree on that. I am going to assume that this movement would start in blue states, but we're never going to get to the threshold, right, required to justify this until we convince our fellow citizens in red states, right, where we need to get to 3/4 of the states. We really are going to have to do good, hard work saying to our fellow citizens, we may not agree on policy, we may not agree in partisanship, but can't we agree that our Constitution is our property and we should have more capacity to make it reflect our will, our ideas. And I will say one more thing. Frankly, I think there should be a time frame. I think we should say, let's do this in a decade. That gives us time to do the patient and hard work of convincing our fellow citizens of something they may initially suspect is just another exercise in partisanship. We're going to have to convince them that this is not Trojan horse partisanship, that they too should want to have greater control over their Constitution. But if we cannot convince them over the course of a decade, I think we then need to have a credible alternative. And here I'm going to mention secession, right? That the states that want to have a more 21st century constitution, a more democratically accountable constitution, a constitution that does not let money flood our politics or gerrymandering occur at any time it's politically advantageous to the party in power. And I'm just getting started, right? But there are many things that our Constitution is currently structured or interpreted permits and that thwart democracy. If our fellow citizens do not want that, maybe it is time for us who do to start a new polity, to start anew with a new constitution. It will be ungainly. It will be difficult. It will be costly. But I think at the end of the day, democracy may require, if we cannot fix our constitution, that we break away in order to create a new constitution. So here is my simple and concrete proposal, not particularly well fleshed out, just designed to get the ball rolling. That we have a constitutional convention with a single item agenda, that it needs to be easier for the sovereign people of the United States to amend their constitution and to do so by national popular vote. That this would be a process that would have 2 or 3 basic stages. First, constitutional amendments should be proposed via either, right, 60% of both houses of Congress or 60% of the legislatures of the states of the United States. When you get up to that threshold, it becomes a proposed amendment, right? When an amendment has been proposed, it needs to then be subject to a national popular election, actually 2. If it wins the first time by a supermajority of 55%, it is not yet passed. There needs to be a second election 5 years later, where it also gains 55% control. It should be hard to amend the Constitution. It should take a supermajority that isn't just a one-time supermajority, but a sustained supermajority. But it shouldn't be so damn hard that it's basically impossible, which is where we are now. So that is my proposal. That's my single, simple proposal to fix our Constitution. And by the way, obviously that by itself does not fix the Constitution. But what it does is give us a path to fixing the Constitution in the future that is available, that is realistic, that we can actually use. And then I will just say one more thing. If we were able to do this, first of all, we would have revived democratic constitutional politics, something that has basically withered on the vine in the 21st century, right? We no longer believe that we can change our Constitution, and so we're no longer proposing amendments to the Constitution. If we could do this, we would reopen that incredibly important channel for the people's input into how their politics is structured. And in so doing, my hope, my sincere belief is that we might actually succeed in de-escalating our politics a little bit, that we might begin to recognize there are certain things that unite us, partisan differences notwithstanding, and that would include coming to some shared understanding of what we want the Constitution to do. And that the only way to bring that into our politics is to make that a realistic possibility, that we can influence what our Constitution does via our politics, not simply wait for the Supreme Court to tell us what the Constitution means. That's not working. It's time to recognize that. It's time to try something else. All right, I will stop there. Obviously, I've shared a lot with you today. I'm trying to bring this series of lectures to a conclusion. I'm also trying to share a proposal with you. I'm curious to hear what you think. Who wants to start us out? Renee, it looks like you're raising your hand. Go ahead. And then Flossie, I see you raising your hand now as well. You're both going to have to unmute yourselves. But Renee, go ahead.
I'm thrilled to see that someone actually thought out an opportunity. And, I don't know if it could ever be done, but I think it's wonderful to make that. And it's not changing everybody, trying to change everybody's ideas. It's just making a process simpler. So I'd love to see it through, yeah.
Thank you, Renee. And I think one of the things I get accused of is I'm always depressing. I'm good at identifying the problem, but not so good at identifying the solution. Today I tried. I
And
tried.
you're the only one I've heard. So
yeah, well,
very good.
Let's spread the word if you like the idea. Flossie, go ahead.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Then we have to redefine what life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness means today. We have to look at it again.
Yeah.
Life isn't just taking in oxygen and having 3 meals a day. And liberty is rather hard to define. But I think they are the principles that make us able to live together. And if an individual is deprived of his right to live, his life right to move, then what has he got? He's got nothing.
Yeah. I like the idea, Flossie, and I like in particular the idea that maybe returning our politics to some of our founding and deepest commitments would be a way of bridging some of our partisan differences, of reminding ourselves that there are things that we care about in common, and that focusing on those common values would be a way for us to move a little distance away from all of the stuff that we fight about all the time. Michael, it looked like you had your hand up. Go ahead.
Yes. Am I unmuted now?
Yeah, you're good.
Okay. Well, it's always been the fear that making constitutional amendments too easy would make it susceptible to capture by the same reactionary forces that have captured the Supreme Court. So how does your system protect against the power of great unlimited disparities of wealth and of concern for personal liberty wouldn't capture it and make things worse?
So it could, and I don't think there are any safeguards. I don't think there are any fail-safe ways of structuring a constitution so that if people with great wealth and invidious design set their minds to it, they may not be able to succeed. Unfortunately, I don't think I have not seen a constitution that, provides that level of safety. So having said that, let me then say, right, that one of the things I assume and I hope that if we had a constitution that was easier to amend, we would be able to agree on and then pursue as an amendment is the idea that unlimited spending by the wealthiest people and corporations is not protected speech under the First Amendment, right? And so we could begin to return to what's sometimes called the anti-oligarchic constitution. The idea is that there have been periods in the history of the court and the history of our society where the Constitution has been understood to protect at least a minimal kind of substantive political equality, maybe even a kind of social equality. And so, yes, there's no guarantee that the people of the United States would outmaneuver the oligarchs of the United States and be able to get that amendment through and then be able to use it to prevent the hyper wealthy, the extraordinarily powerful, from translating their wealth and power into unequal influence over our politics. But frankly, I think the system we have right now has proven so porous to oligarchic capture that it's not like we have a system that protects us from it competing with an alternative. We have a system that has manifestly failed, and I'm trying to open the door to a system that has better prospects. No guarantee, no silver bullet, no failsafe, but at least better prospects for the one power that the people of the United States have. They are the majority. They have numbers on their side. If they can use that numbers in a slow, deliberative way to say, we don't want the First Amendment to license oligarchy. The First Amendment was made for better stuff than that, as Elaine Kagan put it. Right? You know, we need some mechanism. I'm trying to open up the door for a mechanism, and I'm not positive I've got it right, but I'm just hoping that this starts a conversation on how to do it. Go ahead, Mike.
Yeah, it's a great principle, and I think it's a terrific idea, except that you got to have more detail on how you prevent it's being manipulated by the powers that the economic powers of the oligarchic state.
Point taken, and I'll keep thinking along those lines. When I come up with something, I'll get back to you. Okay. All right, David, you've got your hand up.
Yeah, I just hang on a second. I think I just wanted to say that I think Mike is sort of right, but I think that your system dramatically increases the likelihood that the body politic nationally would hold sway. The current system puts so much power in the hands of the small states, just the way that our Senate does, represents a very small minority of states. So I think that anything that moves toward the national body politic is a move in the right direction. And I think we have to decide this not in terms of the context of 2025, but in principle. In principle, we believe that no matter what the current distribution of Democrats and Republicans or whatever parties we have is, that this is a more defensible, moral and ethical issue or approach to making decisions for the body politic.
Thank you, David. And that lets me, I think, reiterate or underline that what I have in mind is not something that probably takes hold right away, right? That perhaps this is something that a Democrat or a Republican can run on in 2028. That if it proves to be popular or viable, at least in an election, that then it probably takes a decade, right, for us to get up to the threshold of all the states that have to agree. And then we have to do the hard work of right, making sure, because, a constitutional convention is something between a can of worms and a hand grenade, right? Anything can happen, right? And so we have to also be well enough organized to make sure that the constitutional convention is productive and doesn't go off the rails. And when I think about Mike's question about being captured by the oligarchs, my God, you want to talk about a big target for oligarchic influence, have a constitutional convention, right? So that this is going to take diligent vigorous work to be vigilant enough to be able to see this from start to end is not an easy or slow project. Yeah.
In a sense, you have to rely on an oligarchically controlled system to vote against its own system of oligarchical control.
We've done this before, right? You know, I mean, sometimes it takes, I'm sorry, a civil war, right? You know, or, you know, a national crisis. But boy, we are not far from a national crisis, or maybe we're just already in a slow moving crisis, right? And so maybe once we recognize just how far gone, how dangerous, and how symptomatic of sickness this moment is, it creates the impetus for doing something constructive to address it.
Well,
right,
God bless you for proposing it.
What's that?
I said, God bless you for proposing it.
Thank you. Well, you know, got to find something to do with my time. So I cook up solutions to our problems. Usually better at identifying them than solving them. Wonderful to be with you guys. Thank you for the opportunity to do this. I mean it when I say I really, this is a highlight of my week every week. And boy, we've been doing it for quite a while now. Take care of yourselves. Be well. I will see you next Saturday. Thanks, guys.
Thank you, David.
My pleasure as always. Take care, everybody. Bye-bye.